that's better. Goedenavond, good evening. We're really happy to greet you tonight so numerously. And we heard still people are coming from the other building to this building. But moreover, we're most happy to receive His Holiness Mar Awa of the Assyrian Church of the East among us this evening here in Leuven. It's a great honor, Your Holiness, to have you here as our honorable guests. It is a historical moment for the faculty and I think even for the KU Leuven in general to have you here as our guests. In our meeting we talked already a little bit before, but I really want to assure you that you're very much welcome and that also students from your church are very much welcome to join our programs. As I told His Holiness earlier, we have an international section of international students, of course, among which not only Catholics but also Orthodox students, Protestant students, Anglican students are present, so to say, in a very ecumenical way. And so we would be happy to receive people from your church, be it priests, deacons, or lay people, to receive them here. And especially this evening, of course, turning to this very moment, we're very eager to hear you, to listen to what you can tell us about the challenges of your church in the contemporary world. And before doing that, I would give you a little present, a small token of our gratitude, before passing the word on to Herman Tuul and our colleague Tuge, to introduce you and to welcome all the honorable people here in the public. But first, I give you this small token. I'll tell the people here and then come. It's a book on the manuscript and precious books in our library, the one you visited this afternoon, and one on Leuven in aquarelle paintings, so that you have a nice memory of this evening. We give it to you together with a bag of KU Leuven and some pencils of KU Leuven. So that
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So now I introduce Professor Tuul, and all I had said is to give you a welcome, which I have done in the meantime. So I have the privilege now to only listen to the wisdom that will be shared with us this evening and pass the word on for the official introduction to Professor Tuul, who together with Phil Furness and Peter de May, and of course with all the support of Mrs. de Necker, organized this very evening for us so nicely. So please enjoy the evening and thank you for coming.
Your Holiness Mar Awa III, the Catholicos Patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East. Your Eminence Mar Oraham, the Bishop of Western Europe, the other representatives of the Church of the East, the priests of the Chaldean community of Malines and Brussels, Mr. Bruno Neve de Méverny, former ambassador, but here in his capacity as president of the Foundation Solidarité Orient, Werk voor het Oosten. Monsignor Boni, who is a member of the Dialogue Commission between the Church of the East and the Roman Catholic Church, and His Eminence Bishop Gouri of the Syriac Orthodox Church here in Brussels was prevented from coming, but sends his greetings. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this special event, the visit of Mar Awa to Louvain, to the Louvain Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies. And I think this visit is important for two reasons. First, Mar Awa is the leader of a church with a great past, a rich history, and a great theological, spiritual, and liturgical tradition, just to mention the two names of Ephraim the Syrian and Isaac of Nineveh, both also saints in the Roman Catholic Church. Pope John Paul II has once said that the Church breathes through two lungs. Professor Sebastian Brock suggested that this metaphor is somewhat inadequate because it would reduce Christianity to the Latin and to the Greek traditions and overlooks very much the Syriac world, the Semitic world of Christianity, expressed in a language that is close to the language of Jesus and of the apostles, and which gives, of course, to this tradition a richness and a flavor of its own. In this year, we celebrate the Council of Nicaea 1,700 years ago, and it is good to remember that the Church of the East only accepted Nicaea about a little bit more than 80 years after the council itself. The Church of the East originated in the Persian Empire, let's say present-day Iraq. That was Christianized at the beginning of the 2nd century. And in this early Persian period, the Church witnessed periods of fierce persecution, but was also able to establish ecclesiastical structures which allowed her to affirm her autonomy towards the other centers of Christianity, towards Antioch, towards Constantinople, and towards Rome. In other words, the Church of the East became a patriarchal church, claiming apostolic origins similar to the other churches. Because of an outspoken Diophysite Christology, emphasizing the intrinsic unity, but also the distinction between the humanity and the divinity of Jesus Christ, this church was very much accused of Nestorianism. And this accusation led to a strong marginalization of the Church of the East. But of course, when I say marginalization, I mean marginalization seen from a Western perspective, because in the East itself, the situation was, of course, quite different, where the church developed into the major Christian community of the region. In the Islamic period, the patriarchs were the privileged interlocutors for Muslim scholars and even for the caliphs, and it were East Syriac scholars who transmitted Greek philosophy and science to the Islamic world. The flourishing of an Islamic civilization would not have been possible without the contribution of the scholars of the Church of the East. One of Mar'awa's predecessors, Patriarch Timothy I, translated Aristotle's Organon into Syriac, and he was a personal friend of the Caliph al-Mahdi. And in this period, the church also sent missionaries as far as Afghanistan and even China along the Silk Road, making the Church of the East, in the period of our European Middle Ages, much bigger, much larger than the Church of Rome. So can you imagine that there were bishoprics in Afghanistan, that there were monasteries in Uzbekistan and in the whole of Central Asia? A period of decline set in after the 13th century. It was the beginning of what I call a dark night. The church withdrew to the inaccessible mountains of Kurdistan, and it lost contact with the outside world. And a heavy blow was brought on the church during the genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire in 1915. And when it became impossible to build a future in the East itself, the Patriarch left the Middle East and eventually settled in the United States. This is the beginning of the formation of a diaspora church. And of course, you can imagine many faithful followed their patriarch, fleeing an impossible situation in the Arab world itself. And of course, it is a sort of a contradiction. The Church of the East having now its spiritual center in Chicago, the Assyrian Church of the East being established in the West. The Assyrian Church of the East, that's part of the official name, Assyrian. What is meant is that Assyrian is being seen as an expression of being rooted in the ancient civilization of the Middle East. But now it is being governed, till recently, from Chicago. In 1215, after the demise of Patriarch Mardencha, the Holy Synod decided to relocate the center of the church to the east, to Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan in northern Iraq, and throughout history, always an important episcopal see, and even for some time, a patriarchal residence. The name of Mardencha is also to be mentioned because it was he who signed the Christological Declaration with Pope John Paul II, where the Catholic Church now recognized the full orthodoxy of the Christology of the Church of the East, thus putting an end to this long tradition of accusations of the Church of the East being Nestorian. It is a landmark event in the relation between the two churches. Mar Awa himself is a son of the diaspora. He was born in Chicago and at a young age ordained a deacon by Patriarch Dencha. He started theological studies in Chicago with the Jesuits and continued later Oriental Christian studies at the famous Pontifical Oriental Institute, where he earned a doctorate in the field of East Syriac liturgy. In 2007, he was appointed Bishop of Modesto in California, another region with an important number of Assyrian Christians. And you can imagine that with his studies at the Loyola University in Chicago and later in Rome, he was almost predestined to become the official representative of the Church of the East for the contacts with the Roman Catholic Church, both at Pro Oriente, the foundation, Pro Oriente in Vienna and in Rome itself. And these consultations between the two churches continue till today and address various subjects such as sacramentology or ecclesiology. In 2021, he was elected to succeed to Patriarch Margivargis III, who abdicated for reasons of health. And Mar Awa continues to reside in Erbil, where, with the support of the local Kurdish authorities, a new official patriarchal residence with a new cathedral was officially inaugurated a few months ago. One can imagine the challenges His Holiness, the Church of the East, has to face. In the first place, the reality of a difficult political situation in the East itself, prompting more and more Christians to leave the region. And to just give you an idea, 20 years ago, Iraq had about 1.5 million of Christians. Now their numbers are being reduced to maybe 300,000. The majority of the faithful of the Church of the East now live in the diaspora of the United States, Australia, and Europe. And His Holiness is now in Europe on a pastoral tour, consecrating a cathedral in London and a youth church and a community center in the Netherlands. And this last center is called after Patriarch Mar Benjamin, killed by the end of the First World War. The Church of the East, rooted in the East, living in the West. How to preserve the Oriental Christian tradition in a Western secularized society. How to look at the past and to reconcile it with the reality of today. And what about the contacts with the other churches? How to be an Oriental Christian in the West. We are looking forward, Your Holiness, to hear your views on the future of the Church of the East. Final word. There is a second reason why we are happy to have you here. As you know, Louvain has a long history of Syriac studies. The French scholar Jean-Baptiste Chabot, who published the Synodicon, that is the collection of synods of the Church of the East, was published by him, critical edited with a French translation. Chabot did his doctorate here, and as a matter of fact, his doctorate on Isaac the Syrian was, I think, maybe the first scholarly study on Isaac the Syrian. Professor André Dahalleux worked here on his edition of the texts of Sardona, and 2 years ago, LOSIAC, with Professor Phil Fornes, organized a conference on East Syriac mysticism. But how important historical and historico-theological studies may be, the living reality of the Oriental churches has always been very much on the agenda of our theological faculty, with a strong focus on ecumenical studies and the interaction of Middle Eastern Christianity with the world of Islam. Your Holiness, welcome to Louvain, to our faculty. May I invite you to share your thoughts.
Well, a good evening to each and every one of you. It is a great joy for me personally and with my colleagues accompanying me this evening to have been received formally at the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at the University of Louvain. I would like to thank the Honorable Dean of the faculty and the many professors who I was able to meet today. I'd like to offer my deep thanks to my good friend, Professor Herman Teule, who gave a very thorough introduction to the Assyrian Church of the East and to many aspects, particularly the ecumenical aspect of the church, which you have saved me about 20 minutes worth of speaking. So I want to thank you for that. A hearty welcome to His Excellency Bishop Boni, who is a very dear friend, many years together on the Joint Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Catholic Church and the Assyrian Church of the East. I'm accompanied by His Grace Bishop Marwa Raham, the Bishop for the Diocese of Western Europe of the Assyrian Church, the Reverend Fathers who are here, and all of you, dear professors, students, and the community of Louvain. Thank you for receiving me once again. It has been my great joy. I'd also like to welcome members of the parish of Mar Sergis and Mar Bacchus of the Assyrian Church of the East present in Brussels. And I'd like to welcome our brothers from the Chaldean Church, the Reverend Fathers, and the faithful who are accompanying them. My talk this evening will concentrate on two aspects of the life of the Assyrian Church today, predominantly in the Middle East and in the diaspora. And of course, Herman touched upon the importance of that and what our church has faced these past few decades. With respect to the life of the Assyrian Church in the Middle East, particularly in Iraq, and of course, as he mentioned, the Patriarchate of our church has returned to Iraq, particularly to Erbil, which is the capital of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, since 2015, with the election and enthronement of my predecessor, Margi Vergis III. There has always been a discussion on religious freedom in the country as a whole, with respect to the religious minorities, among them the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Syriacs, the non-Christian minorities such as the Yazidis, for example, etc. And when we look at the other aspect, of course, the life of the Assyrian Church outside of the Middle East, outside of the homeland, in various parts of the Western world, such as North America, Europe, and Australia, for example. First, I'd like to look at the challenge that we face predominantly in the Middle East as a whole and in Iraq particularly, and that is with respect to religious freedom. Religious freedom, of course, as you know, is among the fundamental liberties guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And despite the fact that since then it was affirmed in various international conventions related to the rights of individuals and communities, and although most countries have ratified and approved these charters, in most cases it has not turned into a life practice that is felt and lived by individuals and communities who believe in a belief or adhere to a belief or an opinion, or who belong to an ethno-religious identity, such as the Assyrian Church, different from that of the majority component of the country, and that is the fact in Iraq now. More often than not, these charters and their texts remain in the archives of the institutions of states, or they have become formal texts in constitutions and legislations without the country's legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government concretely adhering to them. Freedom of religion and belief did not receive international attention until our global world turned into a, quote, small village that shares the details of daily life across geographical and political borders. This is especially true in our present cyber age, and the platforms, spaces, and mechanisms it provides that are difficult for governments to control or to censure. One of the contradictions of our small global village is that with increasing interest in the rights and freedoms of individuals and groups concerning opinion and belief, whether they are the majority or otherwise, the violations of these rights and the suppression of these freedoms are also on the rise in various contexts, thus creating a vertical split and a wide gap between what exists and what should exist. However, what gives rise to optimism is that the small size of our, quote, global village and the various possibilities of communication between its inhabitants provides support to individuals and groups whose rights are indeed violated in one way or another, in order to be able to make an international issue that uncovers the pretext of violators who have long hidden their violations by claiming them as a national security matter or a sovereign issue of the state. The importance of guaranteeing and enhancing the rights of opinion and belief for individuals and groups is doubled when we realize that either violating them or not being able to guarantee them creates an environment that depletes the human resources of societies and countries in terms of the, quote, migration bleeding of intellectual elites and minority societies that are different somehow from the majority group in their identity. As such, this may be considered to be a, quote, forced migration with all the risks that it creates for the existence and future of these societies, and for the identity of the state by distorting it and disconnecting it from its roots. In the last 4 decades, Iraq has indeed suffered from all that I have just described above. And what has happened and is happening to the religious and ethnic components of its historical and rich mosaic of peoples is continued migration and displacement due to a set of factors, one of which, if not the most important one, is the failure of the Iraqi state and its institutions, and in various respects even the constitution itself, to guarantee the freedom of religion and belief for both individuals and so-called minority communities. Of course, in the West, or in Western countries, if you're a minority, that's a very good thing. In the East, if you're a minority, that is not necessarily the case. This includes the imposition of one homogeneous identity, that is, the identity of the majority, especially the religious identity, upon all. By way of description and an example, Article 26 of the National Identity Law of Iraq, which legalizes the Islamization of minors, those under 18, is only one of many examples of these violations, which cumulatively led to making legislation and societal practices concerning freedom of religion and belief, and which proved to be suppressive forces for the non-Muslim minorities. With the fragile situation of freedom of religion and belief in the Middle East and its regional neighborhood, and in order to immunize Iraq and Kurdistan from its consequences, and with the pursuit of a modern civil state, those criteria of civility are not economic resources or infrastructures, despite their importance, but having as the most important indicator by which to ensure the dignity of individuals and components in guaranteeing and enhancing their basic rights and freedoms. We believe in the importance of facing this challenge and considering it one of the priorities of the work of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, of civil society, of various religious institutions, by means of a strategic plan that should include, among other things, 1, the spreading of community awareness of the basic principles of the rights of individuals and groups, the foremost of which is the freedom of religion and belief, and the acceptance of minority and other non-minority opinions. And these need to be enshrined in law. Secondly, to recognize, accept, and be familiar with, and to publicize diversity in various fields, including the public sector. In both of these contexts, school curricula and their revision, religious platforms and their contents, and those in charge of them have the greatest role to play in order to achieve these desired results. Thirdly, the review of judicial legislation coupled with daily societal behaviors to ensure that the freedom of religion and belief of all peoples is respected and enshrined in the Constitution, and to guarantee societal justice and human dignity for all. However, at present, the major issue that the Assyrian Church of the East and the other historical Christian churches in the country, such as the Chaldean Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Syriac Catholic Church, etc., are dealing with is the steady flow of migration to the West. So there is a bleeding, a hemorrhaging of our faithful from the country to the West. To say nothing of the displacement of the faithful within their home countries. And of course, with the context of Iraq, we saw this especially in 2014 with the onslaught of ISIS that affected a major demographic shift for all of the Christian communities in the country. The diaspora, no doubt, is not a new phenomenon for all of the Syriac-speaking churches in Iraq, but still new challenges and new questions are posed to the leadership of our churches, some of whom are now predominantly in the West rather than in the East, dealing with matters of their survival and the continuance of future generations and their identity. Our classic example again in Iraq, it has been estimated, and Herman, Professor Teuler, touched upon this, that before the intervention of the coalition forces that toppled the regime of Saddam Hussein in April of 2003, there were some 1.5 million Christians in the country, or just a little over 6% of the entire population at that time. More recent numbers produced by the UNAMI, the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, established by the Security Council Resolution 1500 of the year 2003, has a more recent census based on the ecclesiastical censuses of the churches predominantly present in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. In the beginning of 2023, in January, the number of Christians in the KRI, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and I mean the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and the Syriacs, was estimated at about 125,000, with the vast majority of that number, some almost 80,200, living in the historic Christian enclave of Ankawa. Relatively in the province of Duhok, the number of the Christians has been estimated to about some 44,000. These numbers were given to me by the head of the UNAMI mission in Iraq in January of 2023, who has since moved on. Now, mind you, these past 2 years since that time, there have been many people who have left the country. On the other hand, when we look at Syria, for example, before the spring of 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, Christians amounted to no less than 25% of the population. And yet, when we look at these same countries today, the numbers are drastically reduced. About 250 to 300,000 Christians living in Iraq, I would say even less than that amount, or 2%, and an estimated 10% are remaining in Syria as of 2018. And of course, those numbers have also dwindled since then. The change of the last regime in Iraq, something aspired to by many of the Syriac-speaking faithful in Iraq, even before the fateful events of April of 2003, had brought a renewed hope to the ancient Christians of the country, at least at that time. As G. Gao observed in 2004, and I quote, "The post-Saddam period signals a critical juncture in Iraq's history, and perhaps a key indicator of the country's democratic pluralism may be the status of the indigenous Syriac-speaking Christian minorities in the north of the country, the Kurdistan region, namely the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Arameans, and the Syriacs, who variously identify as Assyrians or as Chaldo-Assyrians." And I refer to the work by Greg Gao, which is, quote, "Watching Saddam Fall, Assyrian Refugees in Sydney, and the Imagining of a New Iraq." And this was an article published in 2004. These alarming facts beg the following question: where in the world did the members of these ancient communities go? What exactly are the causes of such a mass and alarming migration of the ancient Christian communities of the East, namely Iraq, to the West? And I quote Constantine Simon, an Eastern Christian priest, who summarizes the situation. Quote, "The precarious state of the churches in the Middle East in today's world due to reasons which are all too evident from even the most cursory news report. Their ecclesial communities are today in crisis, a crisis which stems from serious causes. The still very unsettled conditions in most of the Middle East, the unfavorable and changing political structures, the pressure from Islam and the Jewish state of Israel, the extremely difficult economic and political conditions, terrorism, everyday violence, and a very real danger to life and limb. All this has resulted in the mass emigration of Christians from the Middle East and all its resulting problems. This is the article, Eastern Catholicism, Modern Historical, Ecclesial, and Contemporary Context, a background study to the Synod for the Middle East, published in 2010. This might be seen as stating the all too obvious, but to many in the West, particularly to Western Christians, it actually might be news. The issue of migration to the diaspora communities and the leaving of the home territory of the adherents of these ancient churches, therefore, continues to impact, and I would say in a negative way, and will continue to impact the future prospects of all Eastern churches. Sadly, because the Syriac-speaking churches are few in number when compared with the Western Christians taken as a whole, the so-called third lung, as has been proposed, the challenges become even more manifold. Now I turn to some of those challenges which the Assyrian church faces today. In the beginning of the 1970s, it was estimated that some 300 to 350,000 Assyrians resided in Iraq alone. The migration of adherents of the Assyrian Church of the East began in the early to mid-1970s, with many Iraqi Assyrians coming to the US, Canada, Australia, and various parts of Europe, just before and during the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. At that time, the World Council of Churches was instrumental in proffering the means to relocate these Assyrian Christians to the West. However, the majority still remained in Iraq, as well as in Iran, Syria, Lebanon, and some in Turkey. The Assyrian community, along with all of the other Iraqi citizens, Christians or otherwise, suffered greatly during the 8-year-long war with Iran from 1981 to 88. An estimated, and these are rough estimates, about 3,000 to 4,000 young Assyrian men died during the war in that period. And this created the desire to leave the country once a ceasefire had ensued. It was not until the first Gulf War of 1990-91 in Iraq and its aftermath that the major Assyrian immigration to the West, particularly to North America, took place. An estimated 2/3 of the remaining faithful of the Syrian church had left the home country, had left Iraq, and headed for the US primarily and to Canada. Smaller numbers, as I mentioned, went to different parts of Western Europe and Australia. It was this mass migration that began to fill the churches and the parishes in the US and Canada. This phenomenon also brought many pastoral challenges with it. Now, priests and other clergy were being primarily imported from the Middle East, and they began to serve the faithful who had been in the US, for some of them at least since the early 1970s. Not only did they have to deal with their own entirely new cultural atmosphere and everything that comes with it, but on top of that, they had to deal with the spiritual needs of the flock, already living and in many ways assimilated to life in the United States and Canada. The majority of the adherents of the Assyrian Church of the East in Syria, for example, left the Khabur River Valley region during the late 1980s and the early 1990s. In October of 1999, when the second bishop of the Diocese of Hasaka in Syria was consecrated, there was an estimated population of 25,000 Assyrians residing in Syria at that time. Today, as a direct result of the war in Syria, which began in 2011, and also the kidnapping of 240 Assyrians from the Khabur River Valley villages in February of 2015, today there are less than 1,000 adherents remaining in Syria. On the other hand, the Assyrians of Iran began to migrate in or around 1979 as the result of the Islamic Revolution. Up until the mid-1970s, the Assyrians of Iran, a very affluent community, were no less than 75,000 in number, about half of which, the total number of Syriac-speaking Christians, about half of which were adherents of the Assyrian Church of the East. They specifically migrated to the west coast of the United States, to California in particular, where there was already a significant Persian Iranian diaspora present, especially in Southern California. During the 1980s, and especially at the end of the Iraq-Iran war, many Iranian Assyrians left the country, and the clergymen among them who migrated served in the U.S. as well. In the early 1990s, with the implementation of the IRC project, the International Rescue Committee partnered with the U.S. to facilitate the migration of Assyrian Christians out of Iran and into the U.S. Slightly later, another project known as HIAS, or the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, began to facilitate the migration of Armenian and Assyrian Christian refugees from Iran to the U.S. through Vienna, Austria, where a middle station was operated. Though it was a Jewish aid program in origins, nonetheless, their scope was expanded to include the resettlement of the Christians of Iran as well, the historic Christians, I mean, of course. No less than 4,000 Assyrian Christians of Iran were resettled in the U.S. by HIAS. From 1990 to the present, the vast majority of the faithful of the Assyrian Church of the East have found their way to the West, as I mentioned, to North America, Europe, Australia, and today about 90 to 95% of the total number of the adherents of our church live in the diaspora. Furthermore, no less than 85% of all parishes in the U.S. and Canada were served and are served by immigrant clergy coming in from Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Lebanon. These numbers quite clearly indicate that our church has now predominantly become a diaspora church, the Church of the East living in the West. And a church in the diaspora will always face the perennial challenge of preserving both the ecclesial identity of the church and the ethnic national identity of the faithful, and passing it on to the future younger generations. In the majority of the parishes and dioceses of the Assyrian Church of the East in the Western countries, both the faith of the church and the Assyrian language and culture are taught through various mediums. In the Archdiocese of Australia and New Zealand, for example, the church operates a robust primary and secondary educational institutional system. And most recently, the Nisibis Theological College has been established for those studying the church's faith in a more academic framework. The church has also followed a healthy and vigorous program of the Youth Association in all the parishes and dioceses worldwide. These programs for the youth, ages 13 to 25 roughly, include weekly Bible studies specifically catered for their spiritual needs, annual diocesan youth conferences, semi-annual retreats at the diocesan level, and since 2023, an international youth conference to be held on a triennial basis. And we had our first one in August of 2023 in Erbil, in Iraq. For the adult youth, namely ages 25 to 35, the church, particularly in North America, has recently began a ministry called the Salt and Light Ministry in order to cater to the older youth, who are not youth now, who are married predominantly, and to bring them back to the church and to have them be more active, although they might have left or fallen out of church attendance for various reasons. In addition, religious education programs for children are offered at the parochial level for the age group of 5 to 12 years. These are just some of the programs offered by the church in order to address the many challenges facing our faithful in the diaspora. In this brief presentation, I have tried to demonstrate the main challenges of our church, the Assyrian Church of the East, which continues to be today an immigrant church in the West. The challenges faced by us in the East are quite different than those which we have faced and are facing in the West. But nevertheless, the struggle remains the same: to survive and to preserve our rich theological, ecclesiastical, cultural, and ethnic heritage as an ancient church and people. The church is playing and has played in the past historically a very vital role in addressing and remedying these challenges. But our work is not yet done, for we have much more to do. Notwithstanding this fact, we are courageous enough to take up the challenge and to realize that we can better equip ourselves in order to come face to face with the realities which are potentially harmful or dangerous to our survival. And in fact, this is not only our reality today, but this is the reality of all of the ethnic Eastern churches whose roots are to be found in the Middle East, and I have named many of them, where due to political and religious instability, our forebears were uprooted from their ancient and ancestral homelands. And I would like to reiterate the fact, and Professor Toida touched upon it, that the Patriarchate was reestablished in Iraq in the city of Erbil in 2005, because that is the region of the country where it is most conducive to freedoms of religion, etc., to the religious minorities, particularly the many Christian churches that are present there. It is my hope and desire that the small contribution will bring about much awareness to the scholarly community, to students, and to historians of this prestigious and esteemed academic institution, which, by the way, knows the Christian East all too very well. And in so doing, you can help the Assyrian Church and all of the Eastern Christians of Iraq and the Middle East in their plight and in their challenges today in the East and in the West. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness, about this introduction about the challenges of the Church of the East, which of course raises, I can imagine, many questions. So the floor is yours. His Holiness is prepared to answer all the questions you may have.
Maybe almost all of the questions. Just as a disclaimer,
I cannot say that.
Okay. Well, before everything, thank you for presenting this picture of Assyrian people. I think that in Europe we often misunderstood the position of Assyrian people, so thank you again for that. What I want to ask you, it's from position of ecumenical theologian. I think that many share that question with me. It's how realistic is the full communion between two churches of Roman Catholic and Assyrian Church? Thank you.
Bishop Boni, do you want to answer that, or should I do that? Well, as you know, and it was mentioned quite a bit, the Assyrian Church of the East since 1984 began a non-official dialogue with Rome. In 1995, with the signing of the Common Christological Declaration between my pre-predecessor, the late Martin IV, and Pope John Paul II, formal bilateral dialogue began. And that dialogue is divided into three categories. So the first part of it was the aspect of Christology, which Professor Toila touched upon, which was resolved in 1994 with the Common Christological Declaration. In 2017, the second stage of sacramental theology was also, we had reached an agreement with a joint document that was signed by Cardinal Koch and by Metropolitan Marmil Zaya. So the signing was on a secondary level of church authority. And so now in the third phase of dialogue, we are discussing the composition of the church, the structure of the church. Of course, this includes many issues. It includes the issue of primacy at the local, provincial, universal levels, the issue of the position of the Bishop of Rome in these various levels of primacy, etc. So that is the stage of dialogue that our committee now, our joint committee, has arrived at. How and when, I think we'll leave that to the Holy Spirit, because I don't think we can say at that point. So it's something that that really is, the unity of the church is really first and foremost a gift from God. And that is something we have to pray for, because all of the Christian churches more or less are divided today. There are many ecumenical endeavors that are taking place that have brought many churches closer together, so we are more understanding of each other's theology and theological positions, and I think that in and of itself is a great feat, but there is still much more work to do. Just as a point of indication, the Assyrian Church also has another official theological, not theological, but bilateral dialogue with the Russian Orthodox Church. And we have very good relations with the Syriac Orthodox Church, with the Armenian Apostolic Church. So there are various levels of engagement that we're presently involved in. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Your Holiness, for discussing with us about your church and diaspora. I'm myself a member of the Melkite Greek Catholic Church, another church which has experienced a lot of diasporic migration. Yes. And I wondered if you would give your opinion on if the status of diaspora church is one that is permanent or not. Will the church one day, in your expectation, return to its homeland, or will it transform into a more native church in the new places where it has migrated?
Well, thank you for that question. I think personally that the churches that have been planted in the diaspora, I think will pretty much stay in the diaspora, but by the same token, they can also be a force of support for those remaining in the Middle East. The roots of all of our churches, of course, which I mentioned today, are in the Middle East, in one of the various countries of the Middle East. And so it is essential that our roots remain there. Now that in and of itself is a great challenge, of course, to varying degrees depending on what country you're in. But I think that the churches, the offshoots of the churches in the diaspora can be a great source of support for the mother church, if you will, that remains in the Middle East. But I don't think that everyone will be uprooted from the diaspora and brought back to the home countries. I think realistically that's not possible, because now you're already in third, fourth generations who have been born in the US or Australia or Canada or Europe. So it's quite difficult to uproot all of the youngsters and the families and bring them back. I think that would be. And I don't think there is a need for that. It's important for the diaspora churches, communities, to have a very strong connection with their mother church in the East. That is essential in various forms. But uprooting everyone and bringing them back is very, I think, not realistic.
Your Holiness, thank you for amazing lecture. As you might know, in the 1920s, Russian immigrants were saying that they're not in exile, but in a mission. Is there sort of this sense among the Assyrian Christians, not only bringing the older saints like Saint Ephrem or Saint Isaac of Nisibia, but also much more modern, medieval saints and medieval thinkers, or even 20th century thinkers, to the broader audience of the West, and to bring the culture of the Syrian church to the much broader audience which never heard about it? Is there this sense also?
There is definitely the sense of mission. Sometimes it's more subconscious, I think, than intentional, if you will. As I mentioned, many of the faithful did leave for reasons of political instability. So that was on their mind predominantly in order to achieve that stability in their new lives in the diaspora. But by doing that, yes, I think sort of by an act of God, providentially, you have these traditions, and our tradition, for example, bringing saints such as Saint Ephrem, Saint Isaac of Nineveh, Saint Narseh of Nisibis to the knowledge of Western Christians. And I think a very good example of that is this theological institution that is studying such patristic writers and saints. For example, last November, Professor Toila mentioned that we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Common Christological Declaration. We had some various academic and ecclesiastical events in Rome, and I met with Pope Francis at that time. And he took a unilateral decision to include into the Roman martyrology a day of commemoration for Saint Isaac of Nineveh, who was a bishop of the Assyrian church from the 7th century. So, yes, I think a lot of that has been achieved through various efforts. The faithful are now predominantly trying to preserve their identity in terms of the family setting. The parochial setting is very important for us. So in that sense. But in other ways, yes, that sense of mission is also being propagated, if you will, in the diaspora.
Thank you for coming, and I have a question linked to yours. So historically, there was a lot of mission to the east, China, India. I read even to Java before. So I wonder, is it still something that you, as a patriarch, think this is something we can do, like go back to China, to all these places, or is the link completely cut it because of what happened in the past?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. You'll be surprised to know that there is quite a bit of interest coming out of countries such as China, more recently even Mongolia, and other parts of the Far East where Christians are rediscovering their ancient heritage of the Church of the East. And of course, the church has to be very prepared for such a mission. It's not an easy task to undertake, but the interest is there. They are looking into it, and there are questions and messages being sent. There was twice in 2010 and 2012, I was able to go to Hong Kong and to the mainland. And in 2012, I went with a small delegation to Xi'an, which, as you know, was the capital of the Tang Dynasty back in the 7th century. And that is where the mission of the Church of the East began. And I was able to visit the so-called Nestorian Monument of China. And I was even able to celebrate the liturgy of our church in one of the small churches there in Xi'an, which I understand that I wasn't supposed to do, but somehow, please don't quote me on that, but somehow it happened. And I understood that that was the first liturgy since at least the year 1369, which is when we have the last written evidences of the presence of our church there. So I'm glad I didn't get in trouble with the Chinese government, but the parish, the small church that received me in my delegation, they were overjoyed with that. So there is quite a bit of interest, but again, such a mission really requires much preparation on our end. So that is something that still needs to be done.
One small more question. So do you also have people joining who live in Iraq who come from other backgrounds who say, I want to join this church?
In Iraq?
Yeah, Iraq, Syria, Iran.
Well, as you know, in the Middle East, there is more the concept of freedom of cult, of worship, as opposed to freedom of religion as it is understood in the West. So evangelization or proselytization is not as easy. It's something you really have to be careful of. Within Iraq, I would make a strong distinction that in the Kurdistan region, there are a lot of freedoms that are enjoyed, particularly by the Christians. So although there is the sense of religious freedom, in the sense that a Kurd who wants to be a Christian can in fact convert, but then you have the social aspect of how that would be received. So it's not necessarily always a matter of law, but of the social practice. Will the society accept that? It may very well be on the books legally, but not so much socially. So there are many considerations. But in terms of opening churches of various denominations, it's quite easy to do that in the KRI.
If you allow me, I'd like to say a final word and to offer another token of our appreciation to Your Holiness, Mar Awa. Your Holiness, Your Excellencies, Your Grace, Reverend Fathers, dear colleagues, dear students, dear members of the faithful who are here, dear members of the public. It's a profound honor to welcome His Holiness Mar Awa to our city, to our university, and especially to our faculty. For around a decade, the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies has been home to the Louvain Center for Eastern and Oriental Christianity. This center carries forth a centuries-long Leuven tradition of studying Eastern Christianity in all its varieties. The center stands as a mark of this faculty's continued commitment to advancing scholarship on the culture, history, liturgy, and theology of the Eastern Christian heritage. The beginnings of Leuven's scholarly engagement with Eastern Christianity, we like to say, lie in the 16th century. At that time, and this is important to today, it was cooperation between a scholar trained in Leuven, then in Rome, and a scholar of the Syriac heritage that resulted in some of the first publications of Syriac texts in Europe, including the renowned Antwerp Polyglot. In this shared dedication to scholarship, we've invited Your Holiness to Leuven in the hope that we will carry forth this tradition of cooperation. As many here will know, and as surely all of my students here tonight will know, the East Syriac tradition, with the Assyrian Church of the East as one of its heirs, has cultivated a very rich and long history of scholarship over its history. It was in the ancient cities of Edessa and later Nisibis that the Church of the East established the famous East Syriac school tradition. The educational program of the school spread throughout the Persian Empire at that time, and its fame even seems to have reached Cassiodorus in Italy when he was developing his educational program for the Western Church. It was likewise members of the Church of the East who in the early Abbasid period served as the principal translators of Greek medicinal, scientific, and philosophical writings from Greek into Arabic, often with the Syriac intermediary. These Arabic translations, as you will know, made their way to Europe in the Middle Ages, and they influenced the development of European science and philosophy. If we turn to a later period, the medieval tradition of the Church of the East produced such figures as Abdisho bar Bericha, who, in the 13th, early 14th century, stretched the possibilities of the Syriac language, producing perhaps the most intricate poetry ever written in Syriac. In the early modern period, it was the scribe Israel Valkosh who produced some of the first works in the Aramaic dialect Surath, a language that continues to have a place in our society in Belgium today. With these few highlights, it's clear that the study of theology in Leuven has much to learn from the intellectual tradition of the Church of the East. And in challenging times, the return of the Assyrian Church of the East to Erbil and the furtherance of its intellectual traditions there in its diaspora provide courage, hope, and inspiration. With this background, it's my privilege to offer a small token of our appreciation for your visit to Leuven. We'll hand it to you later. A complete set of our journal that is co-edited by the Louvain Center for Eastern and Oriental Christianity, the Journal of Eastern Christian Studies. We hope that you, Your Holiness, will receive this as a sign of commitment to a partnership and further cooperation between Leuven and Erbil, between your church and our faculty. Thank you for taking the time to visit Leuven. Thank you for your words tonight. Thank you for your presence.